Corporal John James Robinson, Gunner John Ronald Robinson, Private Joseph Elwyn Robinson, Gunner Kenneth Robinson, Private Kenneth Frank Robinson, Captain Kenneth Geoffrey Robinson, Gunner Matthew Robinson, Private Matthew Sidney Robinson, Rifleman Mervyn Robinson, Private Murray A. Robinson, Trooper Norman Robinson, Sapper Peter Robinson, Lieutenant Peter Dennis Robinson, Lance Corporal Peter George Robinson, Private Rennie Robinson, Gunner Ronald Robinson, Lance Corporal Ross Edgar Robinson, Rifleman Samuel Robinson, Private Samuel Robinson, Trooper Thomas Robinson, Private Thomas Henry Robinson, Corporal Tom Robinson, Second Lieutenant Vernon Charles Robinson, Fusilier William Robinson, Lieutenant William Beverley Robinson, Corporal William Edwin Robinson, Lance Corporal William Joseph Robinson, Private William Leslie Robinson, Private Alan Robertson, Private Francis J. Robertson, Gunner Frederick L. Robertson, Private Henri Robitaille, Private Arnold Robert Robley, Private Alfred Robson, Lance Corporal John Robson, Private John William Robson, Lieutenant Peter John William Robson, Sergeant Richard Robson, Lance Corporal Robert Robson, Private Robert William Robson, Gunner Ernest Edward Robus, Sapper James Roach, Private Michael Roach, Private Thomas Michael Roach, Private Raymond Rochester, Trooper Roger Amid Rochom, Rifleman Thomas George Frederick Rock, Flight Sergeant William George Rock, Private John Rockwell, Private Frank William Raymond Rockcliffe, Corporal Hugh McCullum Rocks, Sergeant Rockwood, Rifleman Thomas Alfred Rodber, Warrant Officer 2nd Class William John Rodd, Guardsman Eric Roddis, Sapper Henry James Roden, Gunner Thomas William James Rodenhurst, Private John Roger, Sergeant Alan Rogers, Private Aubrey Rogers, Rifleman Henry Rogers, Private Herbert Rogers, Trooper John Lewis Rogers, Rifleman Solomon Rodkoff, Private Alfred Rodley, Sergeant Camille Rodrigue, Private Bernard Victor Rodwell, Sergeant John James Rodwell, Lance Bombardier Kenneth Sergeant Rodwell, Trooper Zachariah Rodwell, Driver Dennis Edward Rowe, Pilot Officer Ernest John Rowe, Corporal Leslie John William Rowe, Sergeant Paul Albert Roeder, Private William Ernest Roth, Rifleman Jack Michael Roffey, Rifleman Edward Michael Rogan, Private George Dixon Roger, Captain Alan Michael Rogers, Corporal Albert William Rogers, Sergeant Andrew Redden Rogers, Lieutenant Arthur Edwin Rogers, Private Cecil Albert Rogers, Private Cecil David Rogers, Bombardier Charles Forrester Rogers, Private Charles Walter Rogers, Lance Bombardier Claude Everly Rogers, Private Daniel Sidney Rogers, Lance Corporal Dennis Rogers, Major Edward Britton Rogers, Corporal Ernest John Rogers, Lance Corporal Ferdinand Rogers, Private Foster Irvin Rogers, Guardsman Francis John Rogers, Major Harry Rogers, Corporal James McGregor Rogers, Private James William Rogers, Private John Kenneth Rogers, Marine Joseph Rogers, Private Joseph Thomas Rogers, Gunner Morris Bagley Rogers, Private Peter Guy Rogers, Guardsman Robert David Rogers, Private Robert Henry Charles Rogers, Private Ronald Rogers, Private Thomas Inman Rogers, Lance Corporal Robert Rogerson, Private Thomas Rogerson, Rifleman Walter Rotansky, Rifleman Henry Rock, Private Robert Frederick Rolfe, Private Alfred Cyril Rolfe, Stoker First Class John Richard Rolfe, Private Peter Curry Rolfstad, Captain John Castledine Roll, Private Richard Roll, Private Henry James Rowlings, Lance Corporal John Thomas Rowlingson, Rifleman George H. Rowlins, Rifleman Gordon Howard Rowlins, Driver Frank Thomas Rollinson, Lance Corporal John Thomas Rollinson, Gunner William Henry Rollinson, Fusilier Adam Rollo, Lance Corporal Ernest Louis Rolfe, Corporal George T. Rolfe, Marine Robert Joseph Rolson, Lance Corporal John Joseph Romanoff, Sub-Lieutenant Julian Roney, Private Robert G. Ronson, Trooper Albert Rook, Private Arthur Henry Rook, Rifleman Joseph Henry Rook, Sergeant Norman Charles Vesey Rooker, Private John Arthur Rookley, Bombardier Alfred Rooney, Private Donald J. Rooney, Lance Sergeant Henry Rooney, Rifleman James William Rooney, Captain Mervyn Edward Roos, Corporal Herbert Arthur Root, Gunner Albert George Roper, Private Charles Norman Roper, Private Ernest Alfred Roper, Lieutenant Leslie William Roper, Able Seaman Nicholas Rosales, Private Albert Edward Rose, Private Alan Edwin Rose, Corporal Bernard Henry Rose, Private Dennis Alfred Rose, Corporal Dennis Edwin Rose, Private Eugene A. Rose, Private Jack Rose, Sergeant James Edward Rose, Private Kenneth V. Rose, Lieutenant Malcolm Rudolph Rose, Lance Corporal Matthew Rose, Private Robert Henry Rose, Lance Bombardier Victor Rose, Trooper Wallace Stanley Rose, Corporal William Alfred Rose, Gunner William James Rose, Flight Lieutenant Arnold Walter Roseland, Lance Corporal Sam Harry Roseman, Trooper Herbert Rosenberg, Private David William Rosenberger, Fusilier Samuel Rosendale, Private Thomas Edward Rosendale, Lance Corporal Adam Rosenfeld, Gunner John S. Rosengren, Private Thomas Henry Rosier, Lance Corporal Ronald Rosamond, Lance Corporal Alan John Ross, Private Albert K. Ross, Private Alexander Ross, Lance Corporal Alexander Duncan Ross, Private Alfred Alexandria Ross, Rifleman Alan Scott Ross, Corporal Alwyn Kenneth Ross, Corporal Colin Ross, Flying Officer Hector Scott Keeble Ross, Warrant Officer 2nd Class James A. D. Ross, Trooper James Aaron Ross, Private John Ross, Lance Corporal John Henry Ross, Private John Johnson Ross, Private John Thomas Ross, Private John William Ross, Private Leslie Donaldson Ross, Gunner Melvin A. Ross, Private Murdoch J. Ross, Private Ronald Gordon Ross, Lance Corporal Stanley Edward Ross, Sergeant Thomas Ross, Gunner Wallace J. Ross, Lance Corporal William Duncan Ross, Private Sidney Rossall, Lance Corporal Edward James Rossiter, Rifleman John Albert Rossland, Marine Horace Walter George Rosson, Private George Roster, Lance Corporal Edward Rostron, Private George P. Rota, Private Lloyd W. Roth, Private Mendel Rothman, Private Edwin G. Rothney, Rifleman George E. Rothwell, Private Walter Rothwell, Private William Ruffley, Private Samuel Walter Ralston, Private Frederick Round, Electrician Frederick Round, Private William Rourke, Private Harry E. Rouse, Sergeant Leonard John Rouse, Rifleman Wallace James Roussain, Private Jean-Paul Rousseau, Lieutenant Joseph Morris Rousseau, Lieutenant Joseph Philippe Rousseau, Private Adrian Leo Rousseau, Rifleman Henry Roussin, Corporal Cyril J. Rout, Engine Room Artificer First Class Edward Bellman Rodney Reuter, Rifleman Theodore Routier, Aircraftsman First Class Alan Bertram Rutledge, Private Frederick Ernest Rutledge, Trooper Joseph Rutledge, Private Richard George Rutley, Private Maurice Rue, Private George Alfred Rowan, Private Roy Roworth, Corporal Harold Robotham, Gunner Stanley Robotham, Fusilier Norman Rowcroft, Private Thomas Rowcroft, Sergeant Edward George Rowe, Private Joseph John Rowe, Private Stanley Munton Rowe, Private Thomas Rowe, Private William John Rowe, Private Frank William Tim Rowell, Flying Officer Charles Allen Rowland, Lance Sergeant Garfield Rowland, Flight Sergeant John James Rowland, Lance Corporal Sidney Rowland, Trooper Thomas Henry Rowland, Captain Thomas Jasper Wickham Rowland, Sapper Harry Rowlands, Private Harry Rowlands, Private James Blake Rowlands, Trooper Raymond William Rowlands, Private Thomas Henry Rowlands, Captain Charles Gordon Rowlandson, Private Norman James Rolls, Private Frank Rowley, Lance Corporal George Rowley, Gunner James Rowley, Corporal James Rowley, Private Kenneth Roy Rowley, Lance Corporal Owen Rowley, Private Peter Rowley, Marine Clifford Rollinson, Private Donald Rowntree, Trooper William John Rouse, Private William Frank Roxby, Private Alexander Roy, Private Alan Roy, Private Arthur Roy, Gunner Gerard Joseph Roy, Private Hector Roy, Private J. A. Mark Orell Roy, Private Joseph Edgar Roy, Gunner Joseph Roland Albert Armon Roy, Private Liguri Roy, Private Louis Valmont Roy, Private Paul Henry Roy, Private Robert Roy, Private Thomas Roy, Private Earl S. Royce, Gunner Charlie Nelson Royer, Private Alan Richards Royal, Lieutenant Gordon Royal, Private John Beckett Royal, Private Joseph Royal, Private Bertram Roynan, Captain James Roynan Jones, Private James Edward Royce, Private Kenneth Neil Joseph Rozak, Sergeant Thomas Ruane, Private Ernest Philip Ruault, Private Harry Rudd, Lance Corporal Leslie William Rudd, Private William Rudd, Lieutenant John Grindrod Ruddick, Private Gordon Rudderman, Private Alfred Ruddock, Corporal William Arthur Ruddock, Flight Sergeant Edwin Rudge, Private Brunson L. Rudgovich, Rifleman Edward Ruff, Gunner Edwin Enos Ruff, Private Frederick Charles Ruff, Private Douglas Garnett Ruffles, Private Harry Joshua Ruffles, Gunner Vincenzo Ruggiero, Lieutenant Thomas Oliver Rugglesbrise, Corporal Albert Horace Rule, Private Andrew Carey Rule, Trooper Arthur Newland Rumble, Trooper John Rumble, Private Charles M. Rumley, Private Rump, Driver George Sidney Rump, Private Walter Richard Rumsey, Lance Corporal Colin Trelawney Rundle, Corporal Charles Cornwall Runham, Craftsman Floyd S. Runnels, Private Donald Running, Private Jack Rusco, Private Cecil Charles Rusdale, Sergeant Arthur Edwin Rush, Trooper Cecil Archibald Rush. Lieutenant Matthew Christie Paul Rush. Private Robert Rush. Sergeant William Henry Rushforth. Private Douglas Vincent Rushton. Fusilier Harold Rushton. Lance Corporal John Rushton. Pilot Officer Peter Ernest Rushton. Lance Corporal William Rushton. Guardsman James Frederick Russ. Flight Lieutenant Hugh Russell. Gunner Albert Russell. Private Albert George Russell. Lance Corporal Alfred John Russell. Private Arthur Albert Ernest Russell. Private Arthur David Russell. Private Charles Geoffrey Russell. Lance Corporal Charles Morrison Russell. Bombardier Duncan Russell. Signalman Edward Charles Thomas Russell. Gunner Ernest G. Russell. Private Ernest Jack Russell. Private Frank Arthur Russell. Gunner Frank George Russell. Lance Corporal Gordon John Russell. Sergeant Harold R. Russell. Captain James Thomas Darnell Russell. Gunner John Russell. Private John Thomas Russell. Lance Corporal Joseph Russell. Trooper Kenneth Russell. Trooper Kenneth William Russell. Private Leslie Edward Russell. Private Patrick Joseph Russell. Private Philip John Noel Russell. Lance Corporal Raymond Morgan Russell. Private Reginald Albert Russell. Lance Corporal Robert Russell. Private Ronald Russell. Lance Corporal Ronald Frederick Russell. Corporal Ronald R. Russell. Guardsman Stanley Russell. Lance Corporal Victor Herbert Russell. Private William Russell. Private William Frank Russell. Signalman William Nicol Robert Clark Russell. Private William Reginald Russell. Private Russell. Private Dennis Russon. Lance Corporal Alvin Milton Rustad. Corporal John Robert Ruston. Lance Corporal Alexander Rutherford. Bombardier James Edward Rutherford. Private John Rutherford. Private Joseph Rutherford. Trooper Leonard A. Ruthig. Rifleman James E. Rutledge. Gunner Bruce Rutter. Private Gordon Henry Ryle. Rifleman William Alfred Ryle. Sergeant Alexander James Ryan. Private Alfred Ryan. Warrant Officer 2nd Class Austin Francis Ryan, Private Carson A. Ryan, Gunner Claude Delman Gordon Ryan, Fusilier Francis Joseph Ryan, Private Frederick Marshall Ryan, Corporal Frederick Michael Ryan, Private George Patrick Ryan, Corporal Gerald James Ryan, Rifleman James E. Ryan, Trooper John Michael Ryan, Sergeant Joseph Ryan, Sergeant Joseph Douglas Ryan, Flight Sergeant Leonard Alfred Ryan, Rifleman Michael Kevin Ryan, Private Murray Ryan, Rifleman Sidney Stephen Ryan, Lance Corporal Thomas Ryan, Trooper Thomas H. Ryan, Corporal Francis William Rice, Private Charles Richlicki, Rifleman Frank Rickman, Lance Corporal William Alfred Rycroft, Private Dennis Ryder, Private Gilbert Henry Ryder, Private Robert Ryder, Captain Peter Anthony Riding, Private George Henry Rylands, Lance Corporal William George Rylands, Captain Reginald Geoffrey Riley, Rigger's Mate Alexander Robertson Ryrie,
Trooper Durwood Arthur Sarr, Private Bertram Sabados, Private Douglas Harry Saban, Rifleman David H. Sabiston, Corporal William Wallace George Sabiston, Trooper Frank Saburn, Trooper Bernard Sacco, Private Joseph Fred Albert Sacro, Lance Corporal James Cameron Sackfield, Leading Seaman Ernest Richard Saddington, Major Frank Granby Sadler, Private Edward Victor Sadler, Private John Sidney Sadler, Private Leonard Sadler, Private Ronald Albert Sadler, Guardsman Roy Thomas Sadler, Private William Sadler, Private Clifford Sagar, Private Edward Sage, Private Roy Edgar Sager, Gunner Albert Edward Saggers, Private Ernest Clayton Sagal, Trooper Walter Sahaluk, Private John William Sale, Able Seaman Sidney George Sainsbury, Gunner John Wilberforce Saint, Lieutenant Jean Saint-Jacques, Craftsman Leonard Horace Saker, Private Joseph Thomas Sale, Private Donald Sales, Sapper Leonard Sales, Private John Peter Saleski, Trooper Albert William Salisbury, Private John Salisbury, Private Reginald William Salisbury, Private Ronald Salisbury, Private William James Salisbury, Private James Salkeld, Sergeant Albert George Salmon, Sergeant Harry Salmon, Trooper James Henry Salmon, Fusilier John Spencer Salmon, Private Stanley Arthur Salmon, Guardsman Walter Salmon, Sergeant Peter Miller Hamilton Salmond, Lieutenant Peter Stanbury Salmond, Trooper Arthur Graham Salt, Private Frederick Albert Salt, Private George William Salt, Private Joseph Saltarski, Captain Leonard Lee Salter, Private Ronald Salter, Private Stanley Sidney Salter, Driver Arthur Salthouse, Private Ubald Fernand Salvas, Marine Wilfred Dennis Sambrook, Soldier Theodore Samietis, Rifleman Ernest Albert Sammet, Signalman John Raphael Salmon, Private Thomas Sams, Corporal Stanley Victor Samphire, Sergeant John Sample, Corporal Clarence Walter Sampson, Private James John Joseph Sampson, Private Mark J. Sampson, Rifleman Alfred F. Sampson, Corporal George Sampson, Trooper John Samuels, Flight Lieutenant Max Samuels, Private Stanley Frederick Samuels, Sapper Sidney Samuels, Private Reginald William Samways, Corporal David Donald Sanders, Brigadier Dennis Charles William Sanders, Private Ernest Henry Sanders, Trooper Frederick R. Sanders, Sergeant Guy Sanders, Captain Charles Graham Sanderson, Private Eric Sanderson, Captain Harry Keith Sanderson, Marine Herbert William Sanderson, Able Seaman Noble Stidolf Sanderson, Private Peter Sanderson, Trooper Ronald Sanderson, Trooper Walter Andrew Sandford, Private Norman Cameron Sanderson, Trooper Sidney Victor Sandals, Warrant Officer First Class David Sands, Private Harold Sands, Private Robert Edward Sands, Lieutenant William John James Sandy, Sergeant Frederick Bertram Sanger, Lance Corporal Alfred Sankey, Private Robert John Sankey, Gunner Samuel Sankey, Private Ambrose Santa, Private Ralph Santini, Lance Sergeant Eric Frederick Sargent, Private Harold George Sargent, Gunner Albert Elbridge Sargent, Private William Philip Sargent, Private Frank Sargenson, Plutonova Sarnicki, Corporal Christopher Sartori, Rifleman Emil Saruk, Private Henry Charles Satchel, Private Edmund Anthony Sattelberger, Private Ronald Satterley, Private Louis Saucier, Private Lorne Sauder, Lance Corporal Stanley Saul, Private Maurice Sommier, Sapper John William Saunby, Private Albert Bernard Saunders, Private Alfred Saunders, Private Arthur Saunders, Private Donald Ernest Saunders, Driver Edward Saunders, Private Frank Saunders, Private Jack Saunders, Private Jack Frederick Saunders, Corporal James Bernard Saunders, Warrant Officer 2nd Class Leonard Eversden Saunders, Private Matthew Saunders, Private Patrick Joseph Saunders, Lance Corporal Ralph Ninian Saunders, Private Ronald Saunders, Private Stanley W. G. Saunders, Leading Aircraftman Thomas Patrick Saunders, Staff Sergeant Victor Charles Saunders, Lieutenant Wilfred Saunders, Private Lucio Sorkilo, Corporal William Thomas Saucy, Private Paul Sauvaggio, Private Sava, Sergeant Frank William Savage, Lance Sergeant Frederick Stanley Savage, Private George Savage, Lance Corporal George Savage, Private George Kitchener Savage, Sergeant James Raymond Savage, Private Patrick Savage, Captain Richard Emerson Savage, Private Joseph Savard, Trooper Henry James Savary, Lieutenant William George Savary, Company Quartermaster Sergeant Stanley Claude Saville, Driver John Saville, Private George Albert Savins, Private Emery Savoy, Private Samuel Edward Savary, Lance Corporal William John Savary, Corporal Albert Joseph Savoy, Rifleman Savatsky, Private Nicholas J. Sawchuk, Rifleman Louis Sordo, Sapper James Ernest Sorden, Rifleman Nicholas Savitsky, Gunner Marshal Vernon Sawler, Rifleman Albert Charles James Sawyer, Corporal Edward Charles Sawyer, Private Frank Sawyer, Trooper John Ernest Sawyer, Lance Corporal Ronald Arthur Sawyer, Gunner Victor Albert Sawyer, Private Jack Saxby, Trooper Frederick Ronald Sace, Lance Corporal Reginald Sake, Trooper Kenneth James Sale, Corporal David Charles Sayer, Lieutenant Humphrey Bertram Sayer, Corporal James Alvin Sayes, Private William George Saysell, Corporal Lawrence Chester Scaife, Corporal Edward George Scales, Private Gerard M. Scanlon, Rifleman Brendan John Scanlon, Private Joseph Henry Scapens, Private Frederick Scarborough, Lieutenant Philip Charles Scarf, Private John William Scarlett, Private Gilbert C. Scar, Private Frank Scattergood, Lance Corporal Ernest William Schaefer, Private Leslie Schofer, Private Alexander Scher, Private Adolf Schieler, Private Otto Ludwig Schiever, Lieutenant Aaron Edward Schifrin, Corporal Oscar Schefter, Private Howard William Schluter, Trooper Emerson John Schmidt, Gunner Leo V. Schmidt, Private William Charles Schmidt, Trooper Edwin Henry John Schneider, Private George J. Schneider, Private Alan Schofield, Lieutenant Alan Bertram Schofield, Trooper Cecil Schofield, Trooper Donald Joseph Schofield, Private Douglas Schofield, Lieutenant George Schofield, Rifleman Jack Schofield, Private Joseph Schofield, Lance Corporal Patrick Charles Peter Edward Schofield, Guardsman Ronald William Schofield, Sergeant William Schofield, Private William Henry Schofield, Trooper Ronald Clifford Schofield, Captain Frank Colin Scholes, Captain Frederick Charles Scholes, Private Peter Scholes, Captain Reginald Frederick Schooley, Lance Corporal Victor Ernest John Schopfer, Guardsman James Shorer, Private Percy Henry Schotz, Private Ernest Schroeder, Rifleman William G. Schultz, Private Alexander F. Shumilas, Sergeant Leighton Oliver Sherman, Rifleman Edmund R. Schutter, Lieutenant Harold Leroy Schwark, Private Donald Reginald Schwartz, Private Lawrence F. Schwartz, Sergeant Robert Siberas, Craftsman Vincent Joseph Cicluna, Sergeant Arthur Henderson Schofield, Sergeant Frederick Scoging, Rifleman William George Scorgie, Private Alexander Duncan Scott, Private Alexander Lowe Scott, Guardsman Alfred Scott, Corporal Andrew Scott, Sergeant Austin Rolfe Scott, Private Bernard Scott, Private Cecil Herbert Scott, Lieutenant David Somerville Scott, Lieutenant Dennis Raymond Scott, Major Donald John Scott, Sapper Edward Scott, Marine Frank Leonard Scott, Marine Frederick Scott, Lieutenant Frederick Scott, Fusilier Frederick Scott, Private George Edward Brown Scott, Private George W. Scott, Trooper Gerald Archibald Scott, Lance Bombardier Harry I. Scott, Private Heber Scott, Corporal James Bernard Scott, Sergeant James Duffy Scott, Private James R. Scott, Private John Scott, Private John Scott, Private John Allen Scott, Sergeant Joseph Scott, Trooper Joseph Scott, Sergeant Leonard Scott, Sergeant Leslie Lionel Scott, Private Patrick Watt Scott, Lance Corporal Percy R. E. Scott, Major Peter Marriott Raleigh Scott, Driver Philip Scott, Private Raymond Dennis Scott, Private Richard Thomas Scott, Corporal Robert Scott, Private Robert Scott, Flight Sergeant Robert Alexander Leslie Scott, Lance Corporal Robert Lowe Scott, Lance Corporal Ronald Scott, Sergeant Ronald Douglas Scott, Private Thomas Craft Scott, Corporal Thomas Edward Scott, Private Walter Scott, Corporal Walter Scott, Lance Corporal Walter Scott, Private Walter Harry Scott, Lance Corporal Walter Mostyn Scott, Gunner William Scott, Bombardier William Scott, Lance Sergeant William Scott, Craftsman William Allen Scott, Rifleman William Charles Edward Scott, Rifleman William John Scott, Sapper William St. John Ross Scott, Private Scott, Sergeant John Schooler, Lance Corporal Charles Edward Scriven, Trooper Gilbert Harold Scriven, Private James Reginald Scrivener, Private William Joseph Scrivener, Private Alfred William Scrivens, Private Stanley F. Scrivens, Private Floyd R. Scriver, Private Joseph William Scudder, Private Stephen Eugene Scudder, Lance Sergeant Charles Bertram Scullin, Lance Corporal James Henry Scully, Trooper John Scully, Private James Arthur Scutt, Trooper Roy Seabrook, Private Thomas Seabrook, Wireman Ernest William Seeger, Sergeant Ivan Charles Seeger, Private Walter George Seeger, Private Arthur Seal, Aircraftman First Class Michael Seal, Gunner Richard Vernon Seal, Private Kenneth Clifford Seaman, Lieutenant Rupert Frederick Seaman, Chaplain 4th Class the Reverend William Alfred Seaman, Trooper Reginald George Searle, Lance Corporal Walter Searle, Private Lawson H. Searles, Private Arthur Edward Sears, Lance Corporal Reginald J. Sears, Trooper Wilbert Gordon Sears, Private Gordon A. Cosserat Moore Searson, Trooper William Seasman, Trooper Frank A. Seastrand, Major George Stewart Seaton, Midshipman Trevor Hamilton Seward, Private John Paul Sebastian, Private Cariog Josue Henri Sebir, Private Robert Raymond Secord, Warrant Officer Ronald William Secord, Private Henry Seddon, Trooper James Monk Seddon, Sergeant Norman Seddon, Corporal John Henry Sedgwick, Sergeant Leslie Sedgwick, Private Henry Seed, Corporal George Ernest Seedall, Private Bert Sear, Private Frederick John Douglas Sefton, Rifleman Harry Siegel, Private George Alfred Seger, Gunner David C. Seitz, Corporal Stanley C. Sivright, Private Cecil Selby, Lieutenant Leslie John Selby, Gunner Patrick Walter Stephen Selby, Lieutenant William Charles Selby, Fusilier William George Selby, Corporal Albert Edward Self, Private George Sellers, Lance Corporal William Thomas George Sellers, Trooper John Andrew Sellers, Sergeant Richard Henry Selly, Trooper Ernest Leonard Selman, Lance Corporal Kenneth Selwood, Private Paul Roy Herbert John Selwood, Signalman Howard Selwyn, Private Albert Leonard Semmons, Private Hugh Semple, Trooper James Foster Semple, Private Michael Senchuk, Stoker First Class Clifford Sr., Private Ernest William Sr., Rifleman Fred Warhurst Sr., Lance Bombardier Jack Sr., Lance Corporal John Sr., Private Norman Sr., Gunner Sidney Sr., Private Vernon Sr., Private William Albert Sr., Sergeant Alec Hugh Sefton, Fusilier George Sefton, Private Henry Sargent, Private Joseph Sargent, Lance Bombardier Wilfrid George Sargent, Private Raymond Leslie Sargent, Lance Corporal Peter Savatka, Rifleman Joseph Savatkovich, Lieutenant James Kevin Seth, Rifleman Joseph Setlak, Lance Corporal Robert Octave Bernard Setti, Private William Arthur Settle, Trooper Jean-Louis Metal Severed, Petty Officer Leonard Charles Severy, Private Thomas Charles Sevier, Lance Corporal Frederick Seward, Private Archibald Wright Sewell, Rifleman Nicholas John Sewell, Private Thomas Sewell, Private Michael John Souris, Private George Morris Sexton, Private John Edward Sexton, Private Ronald Walter Sexton, Corporal Albert Edmund Seymour, Private Bobby Roland Edward Seymour, Private Geoffrey Alec Seymour, Private George Lewis Seymour, Sergeant Norman Seymour, Sapper Robert William Seymour, Rifleman Joseph Shack, Trooper George Shackleton, Rifleman Albert Shakespeare, Private Percy Bertram Shakespeare, Private Edwin Shale, Sapper Felix W. Schaller, Gunner Jack K. Shellhorn, Lieutenant Leslie Prothero Shand, Private Floyd Henry Shank, Flight Sergeant Ernest Thomas Shanks, Bombardier Andrew Hepburn Shanlin, Private Alfred Douglas Shannon, Private John Shannon, Lance Corporal Reginald Arthur Shannon, Sergeant Shannon, Private Ivan R. Shantz, Private Stuart L. Shantz, Flying Officer Donald John Shapter, Private Edward G. Chardelow, Private Joseph Thomas Sharkey, Gunner Arthur Sharp, Private Arthur Reginald John Sharp, Private Aubrey Charles Sharp, Corporal Harry T. Sharp, Private James Sharp, Private Leslie John Sharp, Trooper Martin Frederick Sharp, Private Robert Cecil Sharp, Gunner William Henry Sharp, Lieutenant William Michael Sharp, Private Douglas M. Sharp, Flying Officer George Harold Sharp, Flying Officer Harry Morden Sharp, Private John William Sharp, Private Mackenzie Sharp, Lieutenant Norman Perkins Sharp, Trooper Peter Bruce Sharp, Private William Richard Frederick Sharp, Private Arthur Alfred Sharpin, Lieutenant Ernest Albin Sharples, Gunner Henry J. Sharples, Private Patrick John Sharples, Trooper George Sharratt, Lance Corporal Edward James Shaw, Private Alexander Edwin Shaw, Private Alexander Frank Fletcher Shaw, Private Alfred Shaw, Private Arthur Shaw, Corporal Arthur John Shaw, Lieutenant Bernard Shaw, Guardsman Charles Henry Shaw, Private Charles Henry Shaw, Private Charles Leonard Shaw, Lance Corporal Charles Stephen Shaw, Private Dennis Shaw, Private Dennis Shaw, Private Edward Shaw, Lance Corporal Edward Shaw, Private Edwin Charles Shaw, Fusilier Eric Geoffrey Shaw, Private Ernest Merriweather Shaw, Lance Sergeant Francis Edward Shaw, Gunner Frank Shaw, Lance Corporal Frederick Shaw, Private George Shaw, Private Harold Shaw, Private Harold Shaw, Gunner Harold John Shaw, Warrant Officer Second Class Harry Shaw, Private Harry Shaw, Corporal Henry Shaw, Captain Ian Shaw, Marine James Shaw, Fusilier John Shaw, Private Joseph Shaw, Driver Michael Shaw, Lieutenant Patrick Robert Dupre Shaw, Private Percy Shaw, Lieutenant Peter Shaw, Corporal Rennie Shaw, Lance Corporal Richard Shaw, Private Ross Smith Shaw, Fusilier Thomas Shaw, Lance Corporal Thomas Shaw, Lance Corporal Thomas Cunningham Shaw, Private William Shaw, Fusilier William Geoffrey Shaw, Private William George Shaw, Captain William Meredith Fletcher Shaw, Private John Shawager, Private Isaac Shawanda, Craftsman Basil Shawcross, Lieutenant Geoffrey Morris Scheuer, Private David Shea, Sapper Edgar N. Shea, Lance Corporal Frederick Ronald Shea, Corporal Henry Edward Shea, Private Henry George Charles Shea, Private Ronald Shea, Private John E. Sherd, Lance Sergeant Richard Sherd, Flight Lieutenant James Maxwell Shearer, Private John Shearer, Private Kenneth Shearer, Trooper Robert Shearer, Corporal William Shearer, Sapper John Shearman, Private Frederick John Sheath, Major William Godolphin Conway Shebbeare, Private John Shedden, Corporal Daniel B. Sheehan, Private James Sheehan, Private John Sheehan, Private Roger Sheehan, Corporal Leonard Sheehy, Lieutenant Henry Grattan Sheely, Private Dennis Arthur Sheen, Private Albert Alexander Sheffers, Private Harold Shelbourne, Sergeant Henry Reginald James Shelcott, Corporal Charles Henry Sheldon, Lance Bombardier George Sheldon, Bombardier Gordon G. Sheldon, Lance Bombardier Hollis F. Sheldon, Private Norman Sheldon, Lieutenant John Frederick Sheldrake, Trooper William Shellham, Private John Thomas Shelley, Gunner Patrick Shelley, Gunner Robin Shelley, Private Terence Gilbert Shelley, Lance Corporal William Shelley, Lance Corporal Arthur Henry Shelsher, Lance Sergeant James Edward Shelton, Private Enoch Shenton, Sergeant Bernard Shepherd, Private Albert Shepherd, Corporal Alan Shepherd, Private Colin Robert Shepherd, Private Donald Shepherd, Private Edward Shepherd, Trooper Eric Shepherd, Trooper Ernest William Shepherd, Major Henry Burton Shepherd, Rifleman John Shepherd, Trooper John C. Shepherd, Trooper John Thomas Shepherd, Trooper Lester J. Shepherd, Private Stanley Ernest Shepherd, Fusilier Thomas Home Shepherd, Private Vincent Stanley Shepherd, Lance Corporal William F. Shepherd, Private William George Shepherd, Private William Harold Ronald Shepherd, Private William J. T. Shepherd, Rifleman Robert A. Shepley, Private Alfred John Shepherd, Guardsman Douglas Shepherd, Trooper George David William Shepherd, Lance Sergeant Leslie Frank Shepherd, Sapper Leslie Ronald Shepherd, Corporal Manley G. Shepherd, Private Ronald Shepherd, Signalman Ronald James Shepherd, Private Wilfred Shepherd, Trooper William Charles Shepherd, Corporal William Edgar Shepherd, Guardsman Eric Hugh Shepperson, Lance Bombardier Percy Frederick Sherborne, Driver Arthur Sherburne, Lieutenant Anthony James Copley Shearer, Private Dennis George Sherfield, Private John Albert Shergold, Lance Corporal Peter Henry Shergold, Sergeant Christopher Sheridan, Private Albert Sheriff, Private Alexander Sheriff, Lieutenant Neil John Hendry Sheriff, Private Roy Albert Joseph Sherlock, Private William Kenneth Sherman, Private William B. Sherrod, Gunner Alfred Sherratt, Private Horace Sheriff, Corporal Robert Grant Sheriff, Private George Henry Sherrington, Private Edward G. Sherritt, Lance Sergeant Henry Geoffrey Sherry, Gunner Morris R. Sherry, Corporal Peter Robertson Sherry, Corporal John Ernest Nairn Shersby, Private Albert Roland Sherwood, Sapper Charles E. Sherwood, Able Seaman Jack Sherwood, Private Victor Shoechuck, Private Robert Arthur Fitzroy Shoering, Private Arthur P. Chiaro, Private Alfred Covell Shields, Private George L. Shields, Gunner Hugh Shields, Private James Shields, Private John Shields, Private Robert Hamilton Shields, Guardsman Robert William Shields, Fusilier William Shields, Private Robert K. Shields, Private Arthur Thomas Shears, Corporal William E. Shinton, Captain Robert Gibson Shinnon, Gunner Charles Henry Shipley, Private George Henry Shipley, Private Henry Shipley, Private William Arthur Shipley, Private Willard H. Shipman, Lance Corporal Leslie Victor Ship, Captain Frank Norman Shipham, Private Ernest Shirley, Trooper Mansfield A. Shirley, Corporal Archie E. Shirlow, Private Howard Morley Shurton, Private Sidney Shobbrook, Corporal Frank Shoal, Private Donald Shoemaker, Private James Shon, Corporal Arthur Shone, Private Leslie Albert Shoesmith, Sergeant Edward William Horton Shaw, Wireman Francis Allen Shaw, Trooper Jack Bernard Shaw, Rifleman Robert Shaw, Flight Sergeant Wilfred Raymond Russ Shaw, Private Frank Shoreland, Private George Arson Shorrock, Private William James C. Shorrocks, Private Alfred Edwin Short, Private Douglas Walter Short, Private Edward Short, Sergeant Ernest William Gordon Short, Trooper Lawrence Marriott Short, Gunner Michael John Short, Lance Corporal Robert Short, Lance Corporal Sidney John Short, Private Wesley Walter Short, Lance Sergeant William Jack Short, Private Frederick E. Shorten, Lance Corporal Kenneth Leonard Shorten, Private John Alfred Shorter, Sergeant John Edward Shorthose, Private Douglas H. Shortill, Private Thomas Shortman, Gunner Harley J. Shouldice, Warrant Officer 2nd Class Wright Shovelton, Rifleman John Showers, Sergeant John Robert Showler, Private John David Shrimpton, Private Wilfred Joseph Miles Shrimpton, Private Herbert Philip Shrubsall, Private William Stevens Shrubshaw, Corporal John Franklin Shuart, Lance Corporal Harold Shufflebottom, Private Dennis Shutt, Corporal James Frederick Shuttleworth, Private Wesley W. Schwallock, Craftsman Hugh Alexander Sibbald, Lance Sergeant John Dudgeon Sibbald, Corporal John D. Sibbett, Trooper Frank James Sibring, Private Alfred Ernest Frank Sibley, Trooper James Sidney Sibley, Private Thomas Robert Sibley, Lance Corporal Arthur Siddle, Lance Corporal John Siddons, Private Bernard Sidebottom, Major Geoffrey Reginald Sidenius, Private Cyril Spencer Sidey, Warrant Officer First Class Thomas Sidey, Private John Sidlow, Private William Neville Sidlow, Bombardier William Sidney, Stelech Sidoruk, Private Leonard David John Sidwell, Private John Sievewright, Private Arnold Douglas Siggs, Rifleman Kjartan Sigurdsson, Private Arthur B. L. Silcock, Fusilier Harold Leslie Silcock, Corporal William Silcock, Sergeant Eric John Silk, Private Stephen George Sillance, Lance Corporal Fred Sillitoe, Private Morris Alexander Silwood, Trooper Frank Silverberg, Lieutenant Philip Silvert, Rifleman Elmer G. Silverthorne, Private Albert Edward George Sylvester, Private John Sylvester, Rifleman Norman E. Sylvester, Private Philip Douglas Sylvester, Private William John Sylvester, Lance Sergeant Douglas Reginald Silvey, Trooper K. King Silvius, Colour Sergeant Archibald Dawson Sim, Corporal Gerald George Coisgain Sim, Warrant Officer Second Class James McAlpine Sim, Rifleman Lawrence Earl Sim, Gunner Robert Sim, Private Henry J. Simard, Private Percival Simcock, Private John Gerald Symington, Private Frank Simister, Lance Corporal John Sim, Fusilier Kenneth Sim, Trooper Robert John Simmel, Sergeant Frank Sidney Simmons, Rifleman John Frederick Simmons, Trooper Sidney Roy Simmons, Gunner Walter Charles Simmons, Gunner Dennis Simmons, Private George Percy Simmons, Private Jack Simmons, Private Jack Simmons, Lance Corporal John Henry Simmons, Private Joseph Simmons, Private Samuel Bernard Simmons, Sergeant William E. Simmons, Private Eric Sims, Private Julius Sims, Corporal Wilfred James Sims, Signalman Paul Simoneau, Gunner Edward Simons, Private William George Simons, Lieutenant Edward William Simpkins, Private Albert Simpson, Private Alexander John Simpson, Gunner Arthur Randolph Simpson, Lance Corporal Bruce Allen Adam Simpson, Corporal Charles Beresford Simpson, Private Clarence Simpson, Trooper David Simpson, Guardsman Edward George Simpson, Private Ernest Richard Simpson, Private George Simpson, Private George Simpson, Lieutenant George Edward Simpson, Lance Corporal Gordon M. Simpson, Private Grant E. Simpson, Private Harold L. Simpson, Trooper Herbert Simpson, Private James Simpson, Trooper John Simpson, Private John Simpson, Private John Simpson, Corporal John George Simpson, Lance Sergeant John Montgomery Simpson, Private John Richard Simpson, Sergeant John Stuart Simpson, Private Kenneth Edward Simpson, Private Kenneth Frank Simpson, Sergeant Leonard Simpson, Trooper Percival W. Simpson, Sapper Robert Maxwell Simpson, Private Robert McDermott Simpson, Private Ronald Frederick Simpson, Private Stanley Simpson, Private Stanley Simpson, Flying Officer Thomas Henry Simpson, Private Wilfred Albert Calloway Simpson, Captain William Francis Simpson, Lance Corporal William G. E. Simpson, Signalman William L. N. Simpson, Gunner William Percy Simpson, Corporal William Storer Simpson, Gunner Zacharias Ernest Simpson, Private Alan Sims, Guardsman Elvin G. W. Sims, Lance Corporal Ernest Leslie Sims, Private George Sims, Fusilier Henry John Sims, Lance Corporal Stanley Robert Sims, Private John Edward Sinar, Lance Sergeant Alexander Innes Sinclair, Private Andrew Sinclair, Private Andrew King Sinclair, Sergeant Arthur R. Sinclair, Private Carl M. Sinclair, Lance Corporal Clayton Sinclair, Trooper Earl Stanley Sinclair, Lance Sergeant Eli Victor Sinclair, Trooper Henry Sinclair, Private James Sinclair, Private James Douglas Sinclair, Major John Ernest Craig Sinclair, Private Joseph W. Sinclair, Private Norman Alexander Sinclair, Gunner Peter McGregor Sinclair, Signalman William Sinclair, Lance Corporal Kingsley Frederick Sinden, Private Frank Victor Singer, Private Amos George Singleton, Private Clifford Singleton, Lance Corporal Colin Singleton, Corporal Stanley Singleton, Lieutenant Oliver John Sinnott, Sergeant Arthur Edward Charles Sippets, Lance Corporal Sidney Gilbert Sirrett, Private Stillman Elton Cisco, Lance Corporal James Arnott Sisson, Lieutenant Michael Harvey Sitwell, Private John Richard Sives, Corporal Robert Sives, Trooper Robert M. Sives, Private James Civitar, Lance Corporal Robert Rawlinson Civitar, Private Arthur Henry Sizer, Sergeant Clifford Skier, Bombardier Albert Skeet, Private Albert Edward Skeggs, Lance Corporal Eric Leonard Edward Skelding, Lance Corporal Charles Ernest Skellum, Private Thomas Anderson Skellett, Trooper Henry Leslie Skelton, Sergeant Charles Roy Skeen, Private Henry Skeen, Rifleman Clarence Percy Skerrett, Signalman Frank Skidmore, Private Frederick Vernon Skidmore, Private Joseph J. Skillen, Lance Corporal Neville Charles Skilton, Private Sidney Skingley, Private Arthur Charles Skinner, Corporal Arthur Horbury Skinner, Private Barrington Skinner, Private Bertram Skinner, Private Dennis Edwin Skinner, Private Donald J. Skinner, Lance Corporal Frederick Adelbert Skinner, Private Frederick William Skinner, Gunner Harold Skinner, Private Harry Skinner, Sergeant Howard John Skinner, Captain Norman William George Skinner, Dragon Jan Skulinik, Rifleman John Skvarchuk, Trooper Metro Skvarchuk, Lance Corporal Anthony G. Skvarok, Warrant Officer 2nd Class Alexander Jones Slack, Major Charles Edward Slack, Trooper George Slack, Corporal John Lewis Slade, Rifleman Vivian Adrian Slade, Private Charles Austin Slaney, Lance Corporal Reginald William Thomas Slaney, Lance Corporal Charles Frederick Slatcher, Lance Corporal Albert Lawrence Slater, Private Alexander Slater, Corporal Cecil Slater, Private Charles Henry Slater, Private Edward Henry Slater, Private George Slater, Private James Swain Slater, Corporal James Walter Slater, Private John Slater, Trooper John Slater, Lieutenant Ronald Ambrose Slater, Lance Corporal Ronald Gerald Slater, Trooper Wilfred James Slater, Private William Dennis Slater, Lance Corporal Michael Joseph Danny Slater, Sergeant Clifford Rowland Slaughter, Craftsman Tom Donald Frank Slaughter, Private Alvin W. Sleep, Sergeant William Arthur Ernest Sleep, Warrant Officer 2nd Class Howard Slesser, Captain Hugh Templeton Slight, Private Frank L. Sloan, Guardsman George Lascelles Sloan, Private Thomas Sloan, Gunner Thomas W. S. Sloan, Lance Corporal William Sloan, Captain William Sloan, Private Albert Edward Sloan, Lieutenant James Gordon Sloan, Trooper Robert Henry Slocum, Corporal Ronald Slocum, Private Llewellyn Hoskin Sloggett, Private Ernest James Sloman, Corporal Glendower James Sloman, Private John George Sloan, Corporal Wilfred Douglas Slumsky, Private Charles Henry Slim, Rifleman Steve Slychuk, Corporal Frederick James Smales, Driver Frank Smage, Trooper Clifford Henry Smale, Corporal Albert Smales, Private Alfred Small, Guardsman Harry Small, Craftsman Ian Mackenzie Small, Private Robert Drummond Small, Flight Lieutenant Ronald Harold Small, Lance Corporal Wilfred John Small, Private William A. Smallcombe, Gunner John Smalden, Trooper John Robert Smalley, Trooper Roy Dennis Smalley, Lieutenant Dennis Harold Smallman, Marine Joseph Stevens Smallman, Private Sidney Smallman, Lieutenant Colonel Desmond Smallman Tew, Private Alan Smallwood, Private George Kenneth Smallwood, Private Basil Joseph Smart, Gunner David William Smart, Private Edward William Smart, Private Frederick John Smart, Second Lieutenant Frederick Richard Smart, Private Henry Thomas Smart, Corporal Ivor Thomas Smart, Private James MacDonald Smart, Lieutenant Ronald Smart, Private Sidney George Smart, Sergeant William Charles Smart, Lance Corporal John Frederick Smedley, Driver William Ronald Smedley, Private Lloyd C. Smee, Private William Ernest Smeeth, Sapper James William Eric Smurden, Corporal John Smethurst, Trooper Robert Smethurst, Private Raymond Smiles, Trooper Ronald Keith Smiley, Sergeant A. Morris Smith, Sergeant Alan Lacey Smith, Private Albert Smith, Sergeant Albert George Smith, Private Albert Henry Smith, Private Albert James Smith, Lieutenant Albert Robert Smith, Trooper Albert Thomas Smith, Private Albert William Smith, Sergeant Albert William George Smith, Lance Corporal Alexander Smith, Gunner Alfred Smith, Trooper Alfred Smith, Captain Alfred David Raymond Smith, Lance Corporal Alfred Leonard Smith, Trooper Alfred Richard Smith, Lance Corporal Alfred Thomas Smith, Trooper Alfred William Smith, Lieutenant Alan Edward Smith, Trooper Andrew Macpherson Smith, Rifleman Andrew R. Smith, Captain Anthony Larratt Smith, Private Archibald Smith, Private Arthur Smith, Private Arthur Smith, Trooper Arthur Smith, Corporal Arthur Alexander Smith, Private Arthur David Smith, Private Arthur Frederick Smith, Guardsman Arthur Frederick Smith, Private Arthur Roy Smith, Rifleman Arthur S. Smith, Gunner Arthur William Henry Smith, Marine Bernard George Smith, Private Bert Smith, Private Bertie Walter Smith, Guardsman Bertram Leslie Smith, Private Cecil Smith, Private Cecil James Smith, Sergeant Cecil Stanley Smith, Private Charles Smith, Private Charles Smith, Private Charles Smith, Lieutenant Charles Frederick Smith, Private Charles P. Smith, Private Charles Taylor Smith, Private Charles Walter Smith, Private Charles William Smith, Leading Aircraftman Clarence Gordon Smith, Trooper Claude Drury Smith, Fusilier Clifford James Smith, Corporal Colin Smith, Private Cyril George Smith, Lieutenant David Gifford Smith, Marine David Joseph Smith, Corporal David Lucky Scott Smith, Private Dennis Smith, Private Dennis Smith, Trooper Dennis Reginald Smith, Fusilier Derek Bruce Taylor Smith, Driver Derek John Smith, Petty Officer Motor Mechanic Desmond T. Smith, Private Donald Smith, Trooper Donald Argyle Smith, Lieutenant Donald Jack Smith, Rifleman Edward Smith, Private Edward Smith, Corporal Edward Smith, Private Edward Smith, Private Edward Arthur Smith, Lieutenant Edward Charles Sidney Smith, Corporal Eli Smith, Private Elvin G. Smith, Private Emil W. Smith, Fusilier Eric Smith, Gunner Eric Smith, Guardsman Eric Smith, Private Eric James Smith, Lieutenant Eric Stewart Smith, Private Eric William Smith, Lance Corporal Eric William Smith, Gunner Ernest Smith, Private Ernest Smith, Lance Corporal Ernest Henry Smith, Driver Francis Smith, Rifleman Francis William Smith, Lance Sergeant Frank Smith, Lance Sergeant Frank Smith, Corporal Frank Smith, Private Frank B. Smith, Trooper Frank William Smith, Gunner Fred Smith, Private Fred Smith, Sapper Frederick William Smith, Private Frederick Smith, Rifleman Frederick Smith, Sergeant Frederick Smith, Lance Sergeant Frederick Smith, Private Frederick Charles Smith, Driver Frederick George Smith, Gunner Frederick Reginald Smith, Corporal Frederick Walter Robson Smith, Gunner Frederick William Smith, Private Geoffrey Smith, Private Geoffrey Smith, Private George Smith, Trooper George Smith, Private George Albert Smith, Gunner George Augustus Smith, Private George E. Smith, Gunner George E. Smith, Bombardier George Sergeant Smith, Gunner George Sprintle Smith, Private George William Smith, Private George William Smith, Lance Sergeant Gerald Smith, Private Gilbert Smith, Private Gilbert Dent Smith, Private Godfrey Smith, Private Gordon Arthur Smith, Bombardier Gordon Arthur Charles Smith, Private Gordon Harold Smith, Private Harley B. Smith, Trooper Harold Smith, Private Harold Smith, Private Harold Arthur Smith, Private Harold O. Smith, Lieutenant Harold Simpson Smith, Private Harry Smith, Sergeant Harry Smith, Engine Room Artificer 4th Class Harry Smith, Gunner Harry Albert Smith, Lance Corporal Harry E. Smith, Lieutenant Harry Mosley Smith, Rifleman Henry Smith, Flight Lieutenant Henry Lacey Smith, Sergeant Henry T. Smith, Private Henry Thomas Smith, Sergeant Henry William Victor Smith, Guardsman Herbert Smith, Rifleman Herbert Corville Smith, Lance Corporal Herbert H. Smith, Corporal Horace J. Smith, Captain Howell Percy MacLeod Smith, Flying Officer Hubert Noel Smith, Lieutenant Ian David Melville Smith, Corporal J. A. MacLeod Smith, Lieutenant Jack Smith, Guardsman Jack William Smith, Trooper James Smith, Telegraphist James Smith, Trooper James Smith, Private James Smith, Driver James Smith, Fusilier James Smith, Lance Corporal James Albert Smith, Corporal James Ballantyne Smith, Lance Corporal James Cecil Edward Smith, Sergeant James David Smith, Warrant Officer 2nd Class James Donald Smith, Private James E. Smith, Private James John Smith, Major James Spence Coulter Smith, Sergeant James Thomas Richardson Smith, Gunner James Turnbull Smith, Private John Smith, Private John Smith, Private John Smith, Sergeant John Smith, Corporal John Smith, Lance Corporal John Smith, Marine John Alexander Smith, Private John Duncan Smith, Private John Edward Smith, Trooper John Francis Smith, Flight Sergeant John Frederick Smith, Sergeant John Gillies Smith, Lieutenant John Harry Russell Smith, Lance Corporal John James Smith, Lance Sergeant John Leonard Smith, Trooper John Leslie Frederick Smith, Private John Thomas Smith, Lance Corporal John W. Smith, Private John William Smith, Sapper John William Smith, Private John William Smith, Marine John William Smith, Corporal John William Alfred Smith, Private Joseph Dodds Smith, Private Joseph Luke Smith, Private Joseph Stephen Smith, Sergeant Kenneth G. Smith, Trooper Lawrence Smith, Flying Officer Lawrence Arthur Smith, Private Leonard Smith, Corporal Leonard Smith, Trooper Leonard Bertram Smith, Lance Corporal Leonard Charles Smith, Corporal Leonard Frank Smith, Bombardier Leonard Frederick Smith, Gunner Leslie Arthur Smith, Private Leslie George Smith, Private Leslie William Smith, Guardsman Lewis Smith, Private Malcolm Smith, Gunner Matthew D. Smith, Private Neil Smith, Corporal Norman Smith, Private Norman Ball Smith, Private Patrick Smith, Private Peter Neverauskas Smith, Captain Peter Woodhouse Smith, Private Philip Ernest William Smith, Private Raymond Bertram Smith, Rifleman Reginald Smith, Private Reginald A. Smith, Rifleman Reginald C. Smith, Private Reginald John Smith, Corporal Reginald Robert Smith, Gunner Richard Smith, Private Richard Smith, Lance Sergeant Richard Frederick Smith, Rifleman Richard George Smith, Trooper Richmond Smith, Trooper Robert Smith, Corporal Robert Smith, Gunner Robert Smith, Private Robert Smith, Private Robert Smith, Trooper Robert Allenson Smith, Lieutenant Robert Hayes Smith, Private Robert L. Smith, Private Robert Philip Smith, Private Robert Pyburn Smith, Trooper Robert William Smith, Lance Corporal Ronald Smith, Sergeant Ronald Charles Smith, Lance Corporal Ronald Edward Smith, Sergeant Ronald James Smith, Rifleman Ronald Walter Smith, Signalman Royston Alexander Smith, Private Russell R. Smith, Guardsman Samuel Mark Smith, Sergeant Samuel William Smith, Private Sidney George Smith, Trooper Sidney Henry Smith, Corporal Stanley E. Smith, Sergeant Stanley Waring Smith, Lance Sergeant Stephen Smith, Private Sidney Smith, Corporal Sidney Smith, Sergeant Sidney W. Smith, Private Terence Archer Smith, Gunner Terence Smith, Chaplain 4th Class the Reverend Harry Smith, Trooper Thomas Smith, Trooper Thomas Smith, Sapper Thomas Smith, Sergeant Thomas Smith, Lieutenant Thomas Angus McCoy Smith, Lance Corporal Thomas Charles Smith, Private Thomas Henry Smith, Gunner Thomas Henry Smith, Lance Corporal Thomas J. Smith, Private Thomas S. Smith, Corporal Thomas William Smith, Private Thomas William Smith, Marine Thomas William Curry Smith, Private Tom Smith, Private Vernon Philip R. Smith, Private Victor Cyril James Smith, Lance Corporal Wellan A. Smith, Private Wilfrid Smith, Rifleman William Smith, Corporal William Smith, Private William Smith, Trooper William Smith, Gunner William Smith, Trooper William Smith, Lance Corporal William Smith, Private William Smith, Rifleman William Adnet Smith, Lance Corporal William Allen Smith, Fusilier William Anthony Smith, Sergeant William Charles Smith, Private William D. Smith, Private William Gordon Smith, Lance Corporal William Harry Smith, Sergeant William Henry Smith, Rifleman William Henry Smith, Trooper William J. Smith, Guardsman William Kirby Smith, Corporal William Stanley Smith, Private William Thomas Henry Elliot Smith, Corporal William W. Smith, Private Smith, Private Smith, Corporal Smith, Fusilier Charles James Smither, Lance Corporal Albert George Smithers, Trooper Douglas Arthur Smithers, Lance Corporal William Eric Smithers, Private Jack Smithies, Lieutenant John Stuart Bob Smithies, Trooper George G. Smith-Loggy, Trooper Eric Smithson, Private John Leslie Smithson, Starser Stelech Smolka, Private Walter J. C. Smolkowski, Guardsman John Smout, Captain Harry Lee Smuck, Driver William Thomas Irving Smurthwaite, Private Nick Smizniak, Rifleman John Torbit Smith, Private Patrick Brendan Smith, Corporal Robert Harrison Smith, Private Walter James Smith, Private James Smythe, Private Elmer B. Snare, Rifleman James Snaith, Driver John Snaith, Lieutenant Robert Snaith, Sapper Merle G. Snake, Corporal Henry Snape, Private John Thomas Snape, Trooper Ronald Henry Snape, Private Newton Snar, Private Alfred Sneed, Trooper Andrew Snedden, Private Gordon Stewart Snedden, Lance Corporal John Findlay Snedden, Lance Corporal William Wotherspoon Snedden, Captain Lawrence Edwin Earl Snellgrove, Private John C. Snell, Lieutenant John Duncan Brooking Snell, Rifleman Morris George Snell, Rifleman Robert Frank Snellgrove, Private Frank Dowell Snade, Corporal John A. Snyder, Private John William Snowd, Corporal Edward Burt Snook, Guardsman Edward T. Snook, Corporal Ernest Henry John Snook, Lieutenant Frederick James Primrose Snook, Private Herbert Snook, Private Leslie Snook, Guardsman John Snow, Guardsman Kenneth John Snow, Private William E. Snow, Gunner William Frederick Snow, Private William John Snow, Warrant Officer 2nd Class Joseph James Snowball, Lance Bombardier Bernard Snowden, Corporal Edward Isaac Snowden, Private Kenneth George Snowling, Private George Charles Snowzell, Private Blake F. Snyder, Stelech Sobansky, Lance Corporal Gordon F. Sobey, Private John Soddo, Fusilier Morris Solansky, Private Olaf Solberg, Private Sunday A. Soldo, Trooper John Edward Soule, Private Thomas Soley, Private Bernard Raymond Solis, Trooper Paul Solnick, Rifleman Michael I. Solodyuk, Corporal Albert Victor Solomon, Trooper Bartholomew R. Solimos, Private Alexander William Somerville, Private Gerald Richard Somerville, Flight Sergeant Henry James Somerville, Fusilier John Somerville, Lieutenant Arthur John Charles Soper, Lance Corporal Andrew Sopko, Lance Corporal William George Sop, Private Archibald Sorby, Private Wilfred Sorby, Sapper Charles Alexander Saw, Private Hugh Murray Saw, Lieutenant Edward William Sorrell, Private Harry Sorrell, Gunner Alfred Sorsky, Trooper Joseph Sosnowski, Private Roland Eugene Soth, Lance Sergeant Frederick Charles Southeran, Rifleman Vincent Anthony Soublier, Private John Euclid Soulier, Private Fred Saubutz, Major Douglas Walter Innes Soutar, Trooper Harold Frank South, Private Albert Southall, Private Alfred John Southall, Driver Clifford H. Southall, Corporal Ernest Southam, Private Frederick George Southam, Corporal Lionel Guy Southby, Sergeant Reuben Wilfred Southby, Private Harry Southern, Private Ronald Driscoll Southern, Private Jack Southwell, Warrant Officer 2nd Class Charles Southwood, Second Lieutenant Peter Southwood, Private Herbert Southworth, Private Walter Ronald Southworth, Lance Bombardier George Henry Sowerby, Trooper Jack Sowray, Lance Sergeant Harold Edward Spitzel, Lieutenant Ivor William Spain, Corporal Stanley Ernest Spaulding, Private Thomas Edward Spaulding, Fusilier Thomas Spare, Lance Corporal Reginald Lascelles Spark, Private Edward George Sparks, Sapper Raymond Reginald Sparks, Flight Sergeant Robert Alfred Sparks, Lieutenant Clarence W. Sparks, Private David Henry Sparks, Trooper Headley Raymond Sparks, Signalman James Sparks, Captain Lionel Francis Sparks, Lance Sergeant William Thomas Sparks, Private Harold Walter Sparrow, Lance Corporal Basil Raymond Spall, Trooper Eric Spavin, Corporal Herbert Sporforth, Private Stanley Speake, Corporal Earl Lloyd George Speakman, Private Harry Speakman, Private Walter Speakman, Private Sidney John Spear, Private Charles Norman Finley Spedding, Flying Officer Edward Spedding, Private James Peary Speedy, Private Thomas Speeding, Private Raymond Robert Alexander Spears, Lance Bombardier William Spear, Private Billy E. Spearin, Second Engineer Officer Thomas Spears, Captain Donald Ross Spence, Marine Ernest Spence, Fusilier Ernest William Spence, Private John Spence, Sergeant Norman Allen Spence, Private Spence, Trooper Harold Spenceley, Corporal Alan Spencer, Private Bernard Warren Spencer, Private Christopher Charles Spencer, Lance Sergeant Donald Spencer, Sergeant Douglas Frederick Spencer, Lance Corporal Harold William Spencer, Flight Lieutenant James Basil Percy Spencer, Private Joseph Speechley Spencer, Lance Corporal Llewellyn Spencer, Captain Peter Rowland Spencer, Second Lieutenant Peter William Spencer, Corporal Ralph Ernest Spencer, Gunner Roland Spencer, Corporal Roy Spencer, Lieutenant Thomas Duncan Spencer, Sergeant William Spencer, Lance Sergeant Arthur Frederick Spender, Lance Sergeant George Edward Spendilow, Private George Guy Spendlove, Lieutenant Robert Douglas Spendlove, Private Cyril Frederick Spen, Corporal William Sperry, Trooper Charles Henry Spivey, Private John Robert Spicer, Lieutenant Royston Stanley Spicer, Private William George Spicer, Sergeant Eric Spears, Private Ronald Spears, Private Roy George Spears, Trooper Edward Spite, Rifleman George Spilchak, Private Michael Spillane, Colour Sergeant Clifford Frederick Spilling, Private Peter Edward Anthony Spink, Private Thomas Spink, Private Ernest Spinks, Private Dennis Spittlehouse, Private Kenneth Spokes, Lieutenant Charles Emerson Spooner, Corporal Frank Henry Edward Spooner, Private Harold Spooner, Gunner Rene Joseph Spooner, Private Walter Thomas Spooner, Private Leonard F. Spotton, Lance Corporal George Edward Spraggett, Private Ernest William Daniel Spreadbury, Private Harry Spreadbury, Sapper Leonard John Spreadbury, Private George Ernest Spriggs, Bombardier Robert D. Spring, Private Leonard James Springett, Fusilier Samuel Sprintall, Trooper Gilbert Muir Sproat, Driver John Sproson, Gunner Ramsay Malcolm Sproston, Private Henry Sproul, Private John Spruce, Marine Reginald Gibson Spruce, Lance Corporal Thomas Spruce, Private Stanley Horace Spruzen, Lieutenant William George Spry, Warrant Officer 2nd Class Frank Edward Spurge, Sergeant James Edwin Squance, Lance Corporal Albert Sidney Squire, Sergeant Alfred Edward Charles Squire, Private Howard G. Squire, Sapper Alfred Edward Squires, Gunner Harold Frank Squirrel, Private Ivan M. J. Saint-Andre, Private Roger Saint-Aubin, Major James Richard Saint-Clair Ford, Private Adelard Joseph Saint-Cur, Captain Arthur John Saint-George, Private Edward Joseph Thomas Saint-Jean, Gunner Joseph Arthur Edward Saint-Louis, Private Victor W. Saint-Louis, Gunner Edward Charles Stacey, Private Jack Stacey, Sergeant Peter Benjamin Cecil Stacey, Corporal Phineas George Stacey, Private Edward F. Stack, Gunner George Stack, Rifleman James S. Stack, Lance Corporal John Stackhouse, Private Raymond W. Stafford, Signalman William Aylmer Stafford, Lieutenant Thomas Edward Stafford King Harmon, Private Albert Edward Stagg, Sergeant Arthur Ernest Stagg, Private James Wallace Staig, Private James William Stain, Corporal Kenneth Bertram Staines, Private John George Stainthorpe, Private Reinhardt Stake, Lieutenant Donald Stalker, Private James W. Stalker, Private Edward Thomas William Stallard, Fusilier George Thomas Stallard, Lance Corporal Frederick Thomas Stallwood, Private James Edward Stambridge, Gunner James Stanaway, Gunner John Cyril Stanbridge, Trooper Rex Thornton Stanbridge, Major David Stancombe, Signalman Frank Standen, Private Henry George Staines, Corporal Charles Wilfred Stanfield, Lieutenant Alan Percy Stanford, Private Colin Joe Stanford, Private Jack Stanger, Private Kenneth Stanger, Driver Albert Staniland, Major John Meeburn Staniland, Private George Stanistreet, Gunner Douglas Stanley, Sergeant Edward Stanley, Private Eric Stanley, Marine James Edward Stanley, Corporal James Woodward Stanley, Lance Corporal Samuel Edgar Stanley, Corporal Walter J. Stanley, Private William Stanley, Private William C. Stanley, Signalman William Harold Stanley, Lance Bombardier William Henry Stanley, Corporal Alfred Stannard, Private Frederick Albert Stannard, Private Harold Charles Stannard, Corporal James Stanners, Private James Stanners, Private George Stanovich, Private Robert John Stansbury, Trooper Egerton Herbert Stansfield, Guardsman John Stansfield, Private Edwin C. Stanton, Fusilier James William Stanton, Lance Sergeant Joseph Alexander Stanton, Warrant Officer 2nd Class William Charles Stanton, Private John Stanway, Corporal Arthur Stanworth, Private Roy Harry Stanyon, Rigger's Mate Joseph Leonard Staples, Lance Corporal William Charles Hubert Staples, Private Wyndham James Staples, Marine Hugh John Stapley, Private John Herbert Stapley, Private Ralph J. Stapley, Lance Corporal Frederick Reginald Starbuck, Corporal Louis Henry Starcheski, Corporal Frederick Lewis Stairs, Trooper Carl G. Starfield, Private George Beck Stark, Fusilier Martin Thomas Stark, Gunner Peter Anthony Stark, Gunner Sidney Stark, Captain Vincent Elmer Stark, Trooper Walter Mansell Stark, Trooper Albert John Starkey, Lance Corporal Francis Charles Starkey, Private Stanley Starkey, Corporal John Starkey, Sergeant Cyril John Richard Starks, Rifleman Arthur Lionel Starr, Private Henry Stephen Starr, Private John Frederick Starr, Private Harold F. Starrett, Private Robert A. M. Starrett, Craftsman George Edward Stazulevich, Private Fred Stead, Lieutenant Geoffrey Stead, Private Harry Stead, Driver Herbert Stead, Lance Corporal John Stead, Private Roy Stead, Private Carmen G. Stedman, Private John Henry Stedman, Private Lorne H. Stedman, Corporal Norman Stedman, Private Harry Stedwood, Staff Sergeant Alan Trevor Steer, Private Richard Samuel Steetham, Lance Corporal George Stebbing, Trooper John Arthur Stebbings, Lance Sergeant John Stetcherson, Rifleman William Alfred Steady, Private Anderson Steele, Lance Corporal James Graham Steele, Private Leslie Steele, Major Peter Crawford Steele, Private Robert Johnston Steele, Corporal William G. Steele, Driver Arthur Ernest Steele, Private Edward Steele, Private Francis William Steele, Private George Steele, Private George Young Steele, Private John Steele, Trooper Leslie Horace Steele, Lance Corporal Ranald Steele, Lance Corporal Richard Kenilworth Steele, Rifleman Thomas Steele, Guardsman Earl Abner R. Steen, Corporal John Derrick Steer, Pilot Officer Ronald Steer, Sergeant William Henry Ernest Steer, Private William Charles Steers, Sergeant Harland A. Steeves, Private Lloyd M. Steeves, Private Roy D. Steeves, Rifleman Eggert Stephenson, Rifleman Nicholas Stefanuik, Lance Corporal Alfred John Steffer, Voyeen Kurt Steiner, Private Ronald Steiner, Midshipman David Robert Stenhouse, Signalman Geoffrey Harold Stenning, Private Roy Frederick Stenning, Private Morris Stephen, Major Clement James Kenneth Stevens, Sergeant Frederick James Stevens, Sergeant Ivor Reginald Stevens, Lance Corporal John Stevens, Trooper Richard James Stevens, Sapper Thomas Ebenezer Stevens, Private William B. Stevens, Private Albert Stevenson, Corporal Albert Arthur Stevenson, Private George Stevenson, Sergeant James Stevenson, Lance Corporal John Reginald Stevenson, Private Kenneth Edward Stevenson, Company Quartermaster Sergeant Thomas Stevenson, Guardsman Thomas Stevenson, Trooper Thomas Blaine Stevenson, Private Walter Edward Stevenson, Private Elias Stereo, Private Abraham Aubrey Sternshine, Rifleman Guy Stewart, Corporal Albert Ernest Stevens, Lance Corporal Albert Robert Stevens, Private Alfred G. Stevens, Lance Sergeant Alvin Stevens, Lance Corporal Arthur Benjamin Stevens, Marine Cyril Ernest Stevens, Lance Corporal David D. Stevens, Guardsman Douglas F. Stevens, Private George Stevens, Private George Frederick Stevens, Lance Corporal Herbert Stevens, Rifleman James George William Stevens, Private James Henry Stevens, Private John J. Stevens, Private Kenneth Stevens, Sapper Kenneth Ernest Stevens, Able Seaman Kenneth Victor Stevens, Lieutenant Lawrence Donald Stevens, Trooper Percival Stevens, Lieutenant Richard Donald Stevens, Trooper Robert George Stevens, Private Ronald Stanley Stevens, Sapper Sidney Thomas Stevens, Rifleman Stanley Hamilton Stevens, Private Thomas George Stevens, Lieutenant Trevor Charles Stevens, Private Walter Stevens, Trooper William Henry Stevens, Trooper Archibald Christie Stevenson, Lance Corporal Edward James Stevenson, Private Edwin Stevenson, Private Francis Patrick Stevenson, Captain George Henderson Stevenson, Lieutenant Howard Miller Stevenson, Marine James Stevenson, Lance Corporal James Stevenson, Lance Sergeant James Ernest Stevenson, Trooper James Frederick Stevenson, Private John Sims Stevenson, Private Philip Stevenson, Lance Corporal Robert J. Stevenson, Rifleman Robert James Stevenson, Private William Stevenson, Trooper William Stevenson, Trooper William Joseph Stevenson, Corporal William Murray Stevenson, Private Albert Donald Stewart, Private Geoffrey William Stewart, Private Frederick William Stewardson, Private Albert Harry Stewart, Captain Alexander Stewart, Corporal Alexander Stewart, Private Alexander Stewart, Sapper Alexander Snedham Clark Stewart, Private Alfred Walter Stewart, Trooper Alan Stewart, Lance Sergeant Andrew Robert Stewart, Private Angus Stewart, Corporal Arthur Lawrence Stewart, Driver David Stewart, Lance Corporal David H. A. Stewart, Trooper Donald H. Stewart, Private Donald Lennox Stewart, Fusilier Edward Stewart, Lance Corporal Ernest Donald Stewart, Corporal Ernest G. Stewart, Private George Alexander Stewart, Captain George Barclay Stewart, Gunner George E. Stewart, Corporal George Leslie Stewart, Trooper George William Stewart, Private Gerald W. Stewart, Lieutenant Glenn Alfred Stewart, Private Glenn Earl Stewart, Lance Corporal Hugh Stewart, Private Hugh John Henry Stewart, Rifleman Jack Stewart, Lieutenant Jack Stewart, Private James A. Stewart, Lance Sergeant James Duncan Stewart, Lance Corporal James M. Stewart, Driver James MacDonald Stewart, Private John Stewart, Private John Stewart, Private John E. Stewart, Rifleman John R. M. Stewart, Corporal Melvin H. Stewart, Sergeant Obadiah Matthew Stewart, Private Robert Stewart, Rifleman Roger A. Stewart, Private Stanley George Stewart, Lieutenant Colonel Walter Bryan Stewart, Private Watson Stewart, Lieutenant William Bruce Stewart, Captain William Dunlop Stewart, Lance Sergeant William F. Stewart, Captain William Ludovic Stewart MacLeod, Private Merville H. Stickles, Private Richard John Stickley, Private Ronald Stickley, Corporal Herbert Walter Sidney Stiff, Sergeant Alfred James Wade Stiles, Private Reginald Walter Stiles, Trooper Rex H. Stiles, Private William George Stilgo, Private Roy E. Stilwell, Private Arthur Leslie Stimpson, Private Dennis Jeffrey Stimpson, Private Richard Plummer Stimpson, Major George Henry Basil Stinson, Trooper Sandford F. Stinson, Bombardier Albert W. Sterling, Lance Corporal Andrew John Sterling, Gunner Hugh Murdoch Sterling, Private Herbert Fraser Sturman, Corporal John Henry Stirrup, Corporal John Sturton, Gunner Clifford L. Stitzinger, Trooper Eric Lionel Stote, Private Robert William Stobbart, Rifleman Claude James Stock, Guardsman David John Stock, Lance Corporal Douglas Herndl Stock, Rifleman Herman Stock, Trooper Joseph Grandison Stock, Guardsman Albert Edward Stockall, Sergeant William Edward Stockdale, Corporal Samuel Thomas Stockford, Gunner James William Stockill, Rifleman Frederick Charles Stocking, Private Fred Stockley, Lance Sergeant Charles Isaacs Stocks, Corporal Douglas Stocks, Wireman Leonard Stocks, Corporal Harry Mackenzie Stoddart, Lance Sergeant James Hector Stoddart, Gunner Lorne G. Stoddart, Corporal John Stogdale, Lieutenant Francis Ralph Stokes, Private Frank Norman Stokes, Private George Stokes, Trooper George Arthur Stokes, Warrant Officer Gordon Geoffrey Stokes, Corporal John Cyril Stokes, Guardsman Michael Joseph Stokes, Major Robert Donald Stokes, Second Lieutenant Sidney Leonard Stokes, Lance Corporal Theodore William Stokes, Driver Thomas Norman Stokes, Lance Sergeant Thomas Henry Stokoe, Flight Sergeant Thomas William Stokoe, Sapper Howard Stolar, Private Jack Thomas George Stolworthy, Private Bernard John Stone, Captain Charles Edward Stone, Sapper Clifford David Stone, Lance Corporal Dennis Alfred Stone, Trooper Dennis Wilfred Stone, Driver Edward Stone, Sergeant Fred Stone, Private Fred Stone, Private Harry Edgar Stone, Private Jack William Stone, Sergeant John Rodney Stone, Trooper Melvin Pierce Stone, Able Seaman Samuel Henry Charles Stone, Trooper William George Stone, Fusilier William Henry Stone, Sergeant William Henry Stonebanks, Trooper Kenneth Henry Stoneham, Private Frederick Charles Stonehouse, Private John Stoneman, Private Ronald Stones, Private Walter Stones, Trooper Harold Storer, Private Bert Story, Fusilier Frederick Story, Gunner George Story, Private John H. Story, Sergeant Clarence A. Stork, Private Joseph Storazuk, Sapper Michael Storazuk, Captain Cecil Charles Storr, Private Arthur W. Storey, Lance Sergeant Henry Storrow, Sapper Clifford H. Storey, Trooper Vernon Ellsworth Storvik, Gunner Anthony Stott, Private Eric Stott, Private Francis Stott, Lance Corporal James Stott, Bombardier John Stott, Private John Stott, Fusilier William Stott, Corporal John Hart Stout, Private Kenneth Andrew Stout, Sergeant William Stout, Lance Corporal George William Stovold, Private James Strachan, Lance Corporal James Souter Strachan, Lieutenant Jared Woods Strachan, Major John Norton Strachan, Warrant Officer First Class Stanley George Strachan, Private Victor Strahan, Private Gavin Logan Strain, Sergeant Archibald Strang, Private Arthur William Strang, Rifleman Ronald Walter Strang, Sergeant Robert Charles Strange, Lance Corporal George Frederick Stratton, Trooper Gerald Bryan Stratton, Private Reginald Frederick George Stratton, Lance Corporal Gordon Herman Strauss, Lance Corporal Walter D. Strawson, Private Albert K. Street, Private Charles Herbert Street, Private Donald Ernest Street, Fusilier Ernest George Street, Lance Corporal James Street, Gunner Joseph Street, Private Leslie Bernard Street, Bombardier William Edward Leslie Streeter, Lance Corporal Charles Richard Stretch, Private Nathan Strickland, Private William J. Strickland, Rifleman Arthur Stride, Private Douglas Walter Stride, Private George Stride, Private George Thomas Stride, Corporal Henry Strike, Private Arthur Edward Stringer, Private Charles Kenneth Stringer, Corporal Frank Stringer, Fusilier John Stringer, Rifleman James Albert Strip, Private Antonio Strizzi, Lieutenant Clarence Ormiston Strong, Private Joseph Arthur Stroud, Private George Henry Strulger, Private Alfred George Strudwick, Major Alan James Stewart, Private Ernest Lawrence Stewart, Corporal Robert Stanley Stewart, Private Sidney Edwin Stewart, Private Thomas Stewart, Captain Michael Hamish Alastair Stewart Hamilton, Private George Lyon Stubbington, Private Cyril Cooper Stubbins, Corporal George Frederick Stubbs, Private Gerald Stubbs, Private Kenneth William Stubbs, Corporal Robert William Stubbs, Private Keith Sanders Stuckey, Sergeant Frederick Arthur Studd, Rifleman George H. Studd, Fusilier Jesse Studholme, Private Ernest Herbert Vivian Sturch, Corporal Charles Sturdy, Warrant Officer Peter Sturges, Private Reuben Edward Sturgis, Private Clifford George Sturley, Rifleman Albert E. Sturrock, Trooper Samuel Sturt, Major Edward Grieg Stiff, Sergeant Frederick L. Stiles, Marine Sidney Verdun Stiles, Private Charles Stilianou, Private Eric Such, Flying Officer Mortimer Samuel Sukharov, Private Kost Sukow, Private Harry Lawrence Suckley, Gunner George Sudderby, Corporal Gordon H. Sudderby, Private Thomas Sudlow, Sergeant Dennis William Suffling, Trooper Percy Edward Suffolk, Lance Corporal Gordon W. Suffrun, Lance Corporal Arthur Sugden, Gunner Leslie Suggett, Private David M. Sullivan, Lance Corporal Gordon Patrick Sullivan, Trooper Jack Sullivan, Corporal James Sullivan, Fusilier James Sullivan, Lance Corporal Lawrence Robert Sullivan, Private Michael Sullivan, Ordinary Seaman Wilbur Sullivan, Private William J. Sullivan, Lance Corporal Frederick Charles Sully, Private Samuel J. Summerhays, Sergeant Francis William Summers, Flying Officer George Summers, Private George Edward Summers, Gunner George Joseph Summers, Fusilier James Summers, Private John Henry Summers, Marine Kenneth Summers, Corporal Kenneth William Summers, Private Reginald Francis Summers, Private Arthur Alec Lionel Summersby, Trooper Frank Thomas Victor Somerton, Private William Cecil Sumner, Private Ambrose R. Sopranant, Private Anthony George Surrett, Private Robert Surgeon, Private Cyril John Sermon, Private Edward Sermon, Guardsman Joseph Marsden Sir, Corporal Alfred Surtees, Leading Aircraftman John Rutledge Surtees, Trooper John Wilfred Such, Private Robert Henry Such, Sergeant Jack Sutcliffe, Sergeant Thomas Raymond Sutcliffe, Staff Sergeant Daniel James Sutherland, Lance Corporal Donald Sutherland, Private Francis Edward Sutherland, Private Fraser Sutherland, Lance Corporal George Sutherland, Sapper Henry Budge Sutherland, Corporal Ian Bruce Sutherland, Private John Sutherland, Captain Lewis Lovett Johnstone Sutherland, Flight Lieutenant Robert Lawrence Sutherland, Gunner Thomas Bain Sutherland, Trooper Arthur Sutton, Lance Sergeant Charles Frederick Sutton, Private Christopher Frederick Sutton, Private Edward Ernest Sutton, Bombardier Francis Horton Sutton, Private Frederick Charles Sutton, Private Harry Slater Sutton, Lance Corporal Howard H. Sutton, Driver Lawrence Mark Sutton, Trooper Lawrence Francis Sutton, Corporal Lynn R. Sutton, Private Patrick Richard Sutton, Private Raymond Alfred Sutton, Trooper Raymond Dudley Sutton, Private Samuel William Sutton, Private William Sutton, Lance Corporal Ernest W. Sawala, Lance Corporal Roy Suzuki, Petty Officer Stoker Thomas Edward Swaddling, Trooper Alfred John Swaffer, Corporal Stuart Swales, Trooper Aubrey Charles Swain, Driver Arthur Leslie Swain, Private John Lockie Scott Swainson, Trooper William Robinson Swales, Guardsman Fred Swallow, Lance Corporal Sidney Ulysses Swallow, Lance Corporal Elmer Grenville Swan, Private John Farrell Middleton Swan, Private Charles Henry Swan, Major Kenneth Jeffrey Swan, Private John Swannock, Private Ronald Leslie Swannell, Private Ole Wyatt Swanson, Private William C. O. Swanson, Private Swanson, Private George A. Swanton, Gunner John M. Svarts, Corporal Jack Carter Swatridge, Private Harry Swain, Private Charles W. Sweeney, Private Edward Sweeney, Marine Edward John Sweeney, Gunner Jack Peter Sweeney, Corporal James Sweeney, Sapper John D. Sweeney, Private Lawrence Sweeney, Private Roland Sweeney, Private William Sweeney, Private Harry Kenneth Sweeney, Rifleman Everardus T. Swears, Trooper Charles Henry Sweet, Trooper Raymond A. Sweet, Rifleman Ernest Edward Samuel Sweetman, Sapper Frederick Charles Sweetman, Gunner Stanley Verdun Sweetman, Lance Bombardier Joseph Anthony Swellness, Corporal Joseph William Sweatman, Private Ronald Sweatman, Private Louis T. Swiderski, Trooper John Swift, Trooper Wilfred Edward Swift, Sergeant Wilfred George Swift, Trooper William Swift, Marine Hugh Thomas William Byrne Swindale, Private Robert Edwin Swindle, Gunner Kenneth Wilson Swingler, Trooper Cecil Wallace Swinimer, Private Jack William Swinnerton, Aircraftman First Class Eric Hopper Swinney, Sapper Arthur D. Switzer, Gunner Ronald Henry Sias, Sergeant Richard Sain, Sapper Frank Sykes, Trooper Harold Sykes, Fusilier James Sykes, Private John Sykes, Gunner John Sykes, Lieutenant John Laverack Sykes, Private Joseph T. Sykes, Fusilier Kenneth Sykes, Private Nelson Sykes, Private Sidney Thomas Sykes, Sub-Lieutenant William Allen Flowerdew Sykes, Lance Bombardier Clarence E. Sylvester, Lieutenant Colonel David Allen Syme, Private Charles Albert Gilbert Symes, Sergeant Frederick Charles Symes, Gunner Frederick John Symes, Rifleman Norman Symington, Lieutenant John Parker Simon, Corporal Albert Victor Simmons, Private Melvin Millard Simmons, Private Samuel Simmons, Private William Charles Robert Simmons, Private Frank Simons, Flight Lieutenant Simons, Lance Sergeant Robert Thomas Simpson, Major John David Alfred Sirrett, Private Lionel Frederick Seisling, Plutonova Schubert,
Signalman Morris Frederick Tabarer, Rifleman Stanley Earl Tabernaugh, Private Owen R. Tadgell, Signalman William H. Tadgell, Lance Bombardier Harry John Tadman, Private James Taff, Rifleman Nathan Taffler, Private William Edward Tagg, Lance Corporal James Taggart, Lance Corporal Gérard Taillefer, Rifleman Andrew Tate, Private Charles Tate, Private Charles Edward Tate, Private Croom Patterson Tate, Private Donald Tate, Captain Ian Andrew Tate, Private John Whitelaw Tate, Sergeant Joseph Tate, Lance Corporal Norman James Nicol Tate, Warrant Officer Henry Conrad Benjamin Talala, Private Bertram Bernard Talbot, Captain Gilbert Seymour Wyndham Talbot, Lieutenant Henry Arthur Talbot, Rifleman James S. Talbot, Rifleman Robert William Talbot, Lance Corporal William James Talbot, Lieutenant Henry Lawrence Charles Anthony Talbot Harvey, Trooper Benjamin Frederick Talbot, Sapper James Tallis, Lance Sergeant Clifford A. Tayman, Private Nicholas Tannock, Private James Geoffrey Tancock, Private Alfred Tankard, Lieutenant Alan Ross Tannehill, Private Alfred Arthur Tanner, Private Arthur Edward Tanner, Rifleman Bernard Charles Tanner, Gunner Frank Walter Henry Tanner, Corporal Harold Henry John Tanner, Major James Henry Adrian Tanner, Lance Sergeant John Walter Tanner, Guardsman John Wesley Tanner, Corporal Norman Leslie Tanner, Private Wilfred Gordon Tanner, Private Robert Henry Tannock, Private Frank Seaton Olaf Tanzer, Gunner Michael Tansey, Sergeant George William Taplin, Private Henry Francis Taplin, Private John Henry Taplin, Private Percy William Tapp, Trooper Stanley Tapp, Gunner Charles Henry Tapper, Sergeant Eric Govan Tapper, Sapper Frederick William Targel, Private Lloyd G. Tario, Sapper Robert Daniel Tarlington, Private Charles William Henry Tarrant, Private Reginald Tarrant, Major Reginald Molam Tarrant, Sergeant Roy Thomas Tarrant, Sapper John Tart, Sergeant George D. Tarswell, Gunner Albert Tasker, Flying Officer Bernard Cyril Tasker, Gunner George E. Tass, Lieutenant Guy Hubert Tass, Gunner Robert J. Tass, Private Frank Thomas Tate, Sergeant Harry George Tate, Gunner Kenneth Tate, Trooper Leslie J. Tate, Trooper Peter Gordon Tate, Rifleman George William Tapman, Corporal Ernest Frederick Arthur Tattersall, Marine Norman Yates Tatton, Sapper Abel Tatum, Lieutenant Colonel Bernard Taunton, Corporal Joseph Anthony Tevolier, Private Alan John Taylor, Private Albert Taylor, Sergeant Albert Taylor, Private Albert Verdon Taylor, Driver Alexander Taylor, Private Alexander Taylor, Major Alexander John Taylor, Sergeant Alexander Sergeant Taylor, Lance Corporal Alexander Surridge Taylor, Private Alfred Taylor, Trooper Alfred Taylor, Private Alistair Ian Smith Taylor, Trooper Alan Hamilton Taylor, Private Andrew Ritchie Taylor, Private Arthur Taylor, Corporal Arthur George Taylor, Guardsman Arthur James Taylor, Sergeant Arthur Walter Taylor, Private Basil Edgar Taylor, Private Bernard Taylor, Private Bob Taylor, Lance Sergeant Cecil Alfred Taylor, Guardsman Charles Alfred James Taylor, Private Charles Arthur Taylor, Private Charles Leonard Taylor, Private Charles M. Taylor, Private Clarence Taylor, Lance Corporal Clifford E. Taylor, Private Cyril Taylor, Private David Taylor, Marine Edgar Cyril Taylor, Trooper Edward Taylor, Lance Corporal Edward George Taylor, Corporal Edward William George Taylor, Corporal Edwin Taylor, Sergeant Eric Manley Taylor, Flight Sergeant Eric William John Taylor, Private Ernest Charles Edward Taylor, Private Francis J. Taylor, Guardsman Frank Taylor, Fusilier Fred Taylor, Trooper Frederick Charles Taylor, Warrant Officer Frederick Leonard Taylor, Private Geoffrey Gregory Taylor, Lance Corporal George Taylor, Lance Sergeant George Alfred Taylor, Warrant Officer Second Class George Edward Taylor, Private George Harold Taylor, Private George Harry Taylor, Gunner George Hudson Taylor, Trooper George William Taylor, Private Harold Taylor, Lieutenant Harold Taylor, Trooper Harold Arthur Taylor, Sapper Harold Henry Taylor, Private Harry Taylor, Private Herbert Taylor, Private Herbert Gordon Taylor, Private Herbert Reginald Taylor, Flying Officer Jack Taylor, Fusilier James Taylor, Driver James Taylor, Lance Corporal James Albert Taylor, Private James Melvin Taylor, Driver James Robert Taylor, Sapper John Taylor, Private John Taylor, Private John Taylor, Private John Taylor, Lance Sergeant John Taylor, Corporal John Charles Taylor, Sergeant John Edward Taylor, Private John Reeve Taylor, Private John Thomas Taylor, Corporal John William Taylor, Corporal John William Taylor, Private Joseph Taylor, Private Joseph Thomas Taylor, Private Lee Ellery Taylor, Private Leonard Taylor, Lieutenant McFarlane Walter James Taylor, Guardsman Morris Taylor, Signalman Norman Taylor, Gunner Norman Taylor, Private Norman Walter Dennis Taylor, Private Patrick William Taylor, Private Peter Henry Taylor, Corporal Raymond Emmanuel Taylor, Gunner Raymond Kenneth Taylor, Private Reginald Taylor, Lance Sergeant Reginald Taylor, Signalman Reginald Donald Taylor, Private Reginald Leonard Edwin Taylor, Private Reginald Sidney Taylor, Private Richard Taylor, Trooper Richard V. Taylor, Corporal Robert Taylor, Pilot Officer Robert Taylor, Private Robert Taylor, Lance Corporal Robert Taylor, Private Robert Bayes Taylor, Private Robert Henry Taylor, Private Roy F. Taylor, Private Samuel Richard Taylor, Trooper Sidney William Taylor, Signalman Stanley Taylor, Private Stanley James Taylor, Chaplain 4th Class the Reverend James Shepherd Taylor, Private Thomas Taylor, Lance Corporal Thomas Taylor, Private Thomas Taylor, Warrant Officer 2nd Class Thomas Taylor, Lieutenant Thomas Edmund Taylor, Private Thomas Hamilton Taylor, Trooper Thomas James Taylor, Lance Corporal Trevor Taylor, Gunner Wesley W. Taylor, Guardsman Wilfred Leonard Taylor, Gunner Wilfred Norman Taylor, Private William Taylor, Private William Taylor, Private William Taylor, Gunner William Taylor, Private William Taylor, Private William Taylor, Private William Alfred Taylor, Trooper William Birtle Taylor, Corporal William C. Taylor, Fusilier William George Taylor, Trooper William Gordon Taylor, Private William H. Taylor, Driver William Henry Taylor, Private William John Taylor, Private William John Taylor, Private William Noble Taylor, Private Mark Taylor Lowen, Captain Brian John Teague, Lance Corporal John Mervyn Teague, Corporal Arthur Teal, Lance Corporal Edmund Teal, Private Gerald S. Teal, Craftsman Francis Joseph Myerscough Turle, Private Douglas Terse, Private Alfred Charles Teasdale, Trooper Alfred Reginald Teasdale, Leading Aircraftman Roy Clifford Tebby, Private John A. Tedovich, Flying Officer Arthur Richard Bryan Tedder, Lance Corporal Thomas Tedford, Trooper Victor Ernest John Tedston, Lance Corporal Philip S. Teese, Private Ronald Teese, Sergeant Samuel Teese, Major Dennis Patrick Teichman, Major Henry Telfer, Private George Telford, Trooper Matthew McGill Telford, Trooper Hubert Leonard Temby, Private Reuben Temperton, Lance Corporal Harry Tempest, Private Harry Joseph Tempest, Private Robert Tempest, Private Joseph Temple, Private Leslie Thomas Charles Temple, Flying Officer Roland Edgar Temple, Private William Temple, Private Albert Leslie Templeman, Private Thomas Robert Templeman, Lieutenant Robert Keith Templeton, Gunner William Templeton, Private Richard James Tennant, Private Vincent Ernest Tennant, Private Stanley Charles Tepper, Signalman Walter Alexander James Temmer, Marine Eugene Terrell, Trooper Alan Ernest Terry, Trooper Arthur Terry, Lance Corporal Dennis Terry, Lance Corporal Edward Terry, Captain John Desmond Terry, Captain Kenneth Sidney Terry, Trooper William Terry, Private Fred Tesh, Lance Sergeant Fabian Claude Raymond Tessier, Guardsman Robert J. Tester,